Lara Elborno is one of my favorite guests. She's a Palestinian-American international lawyer, activist, and co-host of the Palestine Pod. She's always welcome, but tonight it's even more important. Lara, welcome back to the show. I want to ask you as a lawyer first. I'll ask you as a Palestinian woman, how the invasion of Rafa, the crucifixion of the women and children there, long described as a red line for Western leaders, but which is now underway. How has that affected you and your community?
Thank you, George, for having me. You know, every day now for the last 7 months, we've been trying to come up with new adjectives to describe the situation and describe what Palestinians in Gaza are going through. And every day the situation gets worse and worse and worse. And I struggle to even find the words to describe to describe to you just how horrific, just how devastating, how apocalyptic, how torturous the situation is for Palestinians in Gaza right now, in Rafah. You have to keep in mind that these are people who have literally been displaced for the last 3, 4 generations. In the last 7 months, they have been displaced by Israel multiple times, some upwards of 10, 11, 12 times. And each time they're being forcibly displaced, they're picking up everything that they have, and they're aimlessly walking in a panic to try to find safety. But of course, we know that there's absolutely no safety in Gaza, because everywhere that they have been told to go to find safety, they have been bombed along the way and bombed when they got there. And let's remember that Rafah is exactly the place that Israel told Palestinians to go to in October when they first started issuing so-called evacuation orders, ordering Palestinians out of their homes so that their homes could be destroyed. And that's exactly what Israel did. Israel destroyed the majority of the homes and civilian infrastructure in Gaza in the last 7 months, kettled the majority of Palestinians into Rafah and told them that that's where they would be safe, when in reality, Israel has been bombing Rafah every single day for the last 7 months. And it's reached such a point where now you have 2 days ago, the Israeli occupation forces have invaded Rafah with ground forces, and we've seen them installing their Israeli flags, using their tanks to run over an I Love Gaza sign at the Rafah crossing entrance, which we know is the only way for Palestinians out of Gaza, effectively sealing Palestinians into the death camp, which is Gaza. By so many people who are following this situation closely, it's been described as Israel implementing the final solution, to this Gaza genocide. And it's a deeply, deeply distressing moment. It's incumbent upon all of us to continue to do what we can every single day to stop the slaughter, to stop the starvation of the Palestinian people and this ongoing genocide.
Well, one struggles to avoid the term for obvious reasons, but it's increasingly difficult to avoid it. It is an attempt to finally solve the Israeli conundrum that they came and took a country, but failed to drive out all of the indigenous inhabitants of that country in the original Nakba. They drove out 800,000 people who've now become many millions, you among them, but they didn't quite succeed in driving out all of them. And so every day, the presence of Palestinians on the land that they stole is a standing reminder of the great crime that they committed. And they have sought so many ways and fought so many times to drive the Palestinian people from the land. They now control the gate, which was previously controlled by Egypt. They can now open that gate and drive potentially all of the 1.6 million people, most of them women and children, through that gate into the Sinai desert. Do you think that's what they're going to try and do?
Well, if we just go off of what Israel's been saying this entire time, very early on into this genocide, their ministers were very transparent. You had Israeli ministers saying that we are now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. You had various proposals that were circulated for the forced displacement of Palestinians, which I must remind is a crime against humanity, saying, oh, well, if we can just convince some Arab countries to take them, maybe we can convince the US and the EU to take the Palestinians. And these are actually policy discussions that were taking place in Israel, and they were not secret. They were happening also in media. Danny Danon was writing op-eds talking about how Palestinians should just go abroad, and we can have, various countries take a certain number, and we can just spread up all the Palestinians in Gaza amongst different countries. So this is their intention according to their own words, and the facts on the ground reflect that that's exactly what they're pursuing. When you see the way that they've carried out this assault for the last 7 months, and they've destroyed absolutely every aspect of society that you need to survive, from all of the universities in Gaza to the almost entire healthcare infrastructure in Gaza to the maintained starvation that is taking place as confirmed by the UN and as confirmed by all of the international organizations that are on the ground, to the destruction of nearly all of the infrastructure. The majority of the infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed, and you have 2 million people who have lost their homes. So the point was to render Gaza unlivable. They have done that. People are barely holding on by trying to survive in tents, which have essentially turned into ovens due to the heat in Gaza at the moment. They spend all day looking for water. It's dirty when they find it. There's no sanitation. There's no safety anywhere because they continue to be bombed. And when they are and they become injured, there's nowhere to go to receive medical care. So you're talking about either quick annihilation or a slow and prolonged and torturous killing that Palestinians are now undergoing. And so these conditions, these circumstances that Israel has created for Palestinians on the ground is making it such that they are intending to leave Palestinians with no choice but to try to survive outside of Gaza. And we've already seen thousands of Palestinians pay the extortionary fees that Egypt, in coordination with Israel, has required of them to escape Gaza at the Rafah crossing over several months. Of course, that majority of Palestinians remain in Gaza, but some have been forcibly displaced. And of course, the great question is, will they ever be able to go back to their homes, or will this just be another chapter of Nakba in Palestinian history?
We'll come on to the future in a minute, but let me test you on the Camp David Accords, which forbid Israel to have forces in the Philadelphia corridor. They forbid Israel to control the frontier directly with Egypt. These Camp David Accords, which essentially form the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, were guaranteed by the United States government, hence the name Camp David Accords, 1979. Is anyone discussing this further egregious breach of international law in the US?
George, we've been discussing Israel's violations of international law and its international obligations literally every day for the last 76 years. And we have been saying that we cannot let impunity reign. And yet, in every single instance, whether it's war crimes or crimes against humanity, or in this case, genocide, or how about before, when there was this consensus of Israel enacting an apartheid regime through the issuance of the reports of the major human rights organizations like Amnesty and Beit Salem and Human Rights Watch in 2021 and 2022, or how about the crime of aggression, or how about Israel's 56-year-long military occupation, which is currently before proceedings at the International Court of Justice on the legality of that occupation, because the international legal consensus is that the occupation, given that it is now a permanent occupation, violates international law just in and of its existence. All of these crimes have been committed day after day after day for decades now. And there has never been any attempt to actually solve the underlying issue by getting Israel to comply with its international obligations and to actually pay reparations, allow the Palestinians their legal right to return, stop stealing Palestinian land, stop building settlements on Palestinian land, and enact the measures that would be required to reverse their violations of international law. What you've just mentioned is just a drop in the bucket of a culture of impunity, which is what has paved the way for this ongoing genocide, and which is what explains why Israeli soldiers, day after day, gleefully post their crimes onto social media. It's confirmation that they never expect to be held accountable for these crimes. So they'll film themselves firing a tank shell onto a Palestinian home and smiling, or saying, "We're going to burn this house," and laughing about it. And this is so dangerous, because what this does is not only does it is it just a stain on all of our conscience as humanity, but it creates very dangerous precedent going forward. Israel is changing international law through its violations of international law that are going unaddressed, and making the world a more dangerous place to live in.
South Africa did, of course, take action. You and I discussed it at the time. The ICJ, the world's highest court, opined that Israel must immediately take certain steps, report back within 30 days. It's now at least 60 days, maybe 90 days. It's double or triple, at least, since that judgment was reached. The matter went for trial, speaking colloquially. What's happened to it? What's happened on it?
Well, at this stage, you have two orders that were rendered by the International Court of Justice ordering provisional measures, which Israel has blatantly ignored. And Israel has pressed on with its genocidal campaign. And as we've discussed before, the court doesn't have any enforcement power. The enforcement rests rather with the UN Security Council, which did render a binding resolution ordering a ceasefire until the end of Ramadan, which of course Israel also ignored. And so what you have then is that it remains incumbent upon the people and upon the states to then seek to enforce these decisions. And I really believe that that's actually what we're seeing with the student encampments right now. They've seen that the law on its own has no potential to actually compel Israel to comply with its international obligations, and that it's on them to build power through a student movement in order to compel Israel to end its genocide, and also compel their governments and their institutions to cease funding and arming and being complicit in the genocide through their investments.
How are the encampments growing? Here in Britain, they are now spreading like wildfire. My own grandchildren, their campuses are now occupied all over the country. SOAS, London School of Economics, the University of London, and many, many others, Cambridge, Oxford. They are following the American example, a good example for a change. But the American encampments have been met with extreme brutality and sanction and punishment, right up to expulsion from the university, refusal to allow people to graduate, and so on. How is that going to affect the growth of that great popular movement?
Well, I think that at every step of the way, the repression by the universities and the militarized police in the US has only strengthened these movements. And I think we have to look at what these encampments are offering society, and also what their demands are, to understand why they are becoming so popular and why every day we're seeing more and more of them. These encampments are offering a different vision for society, a society based on mutual aid, helping one another, community education. We see libraries at these encampments. We see teach-ins. Their values are promoting the interconnectedness of struggle, empathy, the rejection of endless wars, the rejection of genocide as a status quo. And we also know that they have very sensible demands that are rooted in universal principles, humanity, and international law. Of course, their principal demands are to disclose and divest. So that means disclose where all of their tuition money is going and divest from the institutions and companies that are complicit or actively responsible in the mass killing of people in Gaza. Things like weapons manufacturers, tech and surveillance companies, and Israeli universities. And the university administrators have no arguments to challenge their demands on the merits. And so instead, as you said, they have resorted to first collaborating with the militarized police to crush the students with brute force. I think now there's been over 2,200 arrests of students in the US just in the last few weeks. And also, they've resorted to lying about their motivations. It's really insane. What possible argument could be brought against transparency, especially in these unprecedented circumstances of a live stream genocide? What possible argument could be made against divestment? Divestment is actually consistent with international law. The obligations to prevent genocide under the Genocide Convention, which we discussed, was reaffirmed by the ICJ's orders. It's consistent with the UN Human Rights Council's resolution, which was adopted in April, just like 2 weeks before the encampments began, demanding that all arms shipments to Israel cease. It's consistent with the report that was recently issued by an independent task force made up of former State Department officials and international law experts, which found that Israel uses US-provided weapons to systematically attack civilians in violation of international law. It's consistent even with the recommendations from inside the State Department, which were entirely ignored by Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, as revealed in the ProPublica report weeks ago around the time the encampments began, to sanction the Israeli military units that were linked to killing and rape of Palestinians. That's coming from within the State Department. So these are sensible demands: disclose and divest. But of course, neither the universities or the media are interested in having that discussion, so they lie. And they say that these students are simply motivated by hate or anti-Semitism, which of course couldn't be further from the truth. It's so important to remind, not only is it not anti-Semitic to protest the actions of a state committing genocide, but there's no legal duty to protect the feelings of people who support genocide. And finally, we have to remember that Jewish anti-Zionist students form an integral part of those organizing these encampments and saying, "Not in my name." At the Columbia University encampment, for example, we saw a big banner that read "Shabbat Shalom" from the Gaza Solidarity encampment. But the mainstream media, of course, has completely erased their presence altogether because it doesn't suit their narrative. But I think we have to be very clear that if students are not safe on campus today across the United States, it's because those students, including Jewish students, are being beaten and arrested at the encampments with the consent of their university administrators. And that is really the problem here.
Well, I do hope these students are not going to go out and vote for Joe Biden in November. Lara Elborno, lawyer extraordinaire, Palestinian woman, tribune of the highest rank. Thank you for joining us on the Mother of All talk shows this evening.